Good morning and a very warm welcome to this British Standards Institution webinar. BSI has been developing and testing a suite of new standards on nature investment and also preparing guidance and tools to help people use them. The aim is to provide clarity and consistency in these new and growing markets, to support high integrity and to boost private sector investment into nature across the UK. My name is Kerry Tenkata. I'm a non-executive director at Finance Earth. I've worked in policy, business and investment to do with biodiversity and nature since 1990. It's like a very long time. I've focused on biodiversity net gain around the world and in the UK for several years. But today I'm here as the chair of BSI's Strategic Advisory Group for the Nature Investment Standards. When I first got involved in the programme in 2023, the standards were just a twinkle in the eye of Defra and BSI. So it's exciting to be here with you today to track progress, not only on the launch of the new standards, but to hear from people who are already using them. Yesterday, BSI and Defra announced 4 things. First, new biodiversity and nutrient standards were released in version 2, and those are ready for adoption. They're designed to be used together with the overarching principal standard, BSI Flex 701, and that's already in use. Second announcement was a new community engagement and benefits standard. That's a version 1, so it's out for consultation. Thirdly, new assessment guidance is available to help you with the use of BSI's suite of nature investment standards to align your activity with them. And then finally, early adopters of the main overarching principal standard, that's Flex 701, have shared their insights on how they're using it in a set of case studies that are out now. So today we're going to explain and explore the new standards, the guidance and the case studies. How are they relevant for you? How can you access and use them? And what can we learn from those who have already done so? And then after the webinar, we'd really like you to dive in and use the standards and materials in your work. And please share your experiences with us. So the plan today is to equip you with all the information that you need to use the standards in your work. And we'll do this through an introductory keynote coming up in a second, and then 3 short panels, and that will enable you to hear from some of the people who are driving the programme in line with UK policy goals, people leading the development of the standards, and people who've already been adopting them. Thank you so much for all the questions that you submitted in advance. I'll ask a selection of these, which we've kind of clustered together when we're at that stage in the panels. And please, if you have other questions that come to mind now, do by all means submit them in the Q&A. These will be picked up. If there's time on our side, I'll post some more to the panelists. But otherwise, we aim to respond after the event, and we're going to be sending to you lots of information in some links that are coming up. It's brilliant that we have such a great set of speakers, but it does mean we're jolly tight for time today. So I've asked our panelists please to be as succinct as they can. With luck, things will run smoothly to time, naturally. But forgive me if I intervene to move things on, move things along from time to time if necessary. So just some housekeeping. You can see this here. It's in listen only mode right now for the webinar, so everybody's microphones and cameras are off. Tom, if you can hear me, the organisers are asking, could you please turn your camera off? As I said, please feel free to submit questions using the question button that you'll see there at the top right of the screen. There's a question box that should help you if there are any technical questions that you have. You can see in the chat box, if you take a look at it, that colleagues are going to provide some information throughout the webinar with links to useful documents. And then afterwards, we'd be very grateful if you'd give us some feedback. You can listen again or pass this on to others. And to learn more about other events that BSI is going to be running, if you just take a look at that QR code on the right. I think that just about covers the housekeeping, and we can get under sail. So on to our keynote speaker. This is Will Lockhart. Will is Defra's new Deputy Director for Nature, Markets and Investment. We're jolly lucky to have him. Will, fabulous you could join us. Thank you. It'll be really great to hear Defra's views on the standards. And of course, lots of other things are going on at the moment. We've got the land use framework, we've got the government response to the consultation on mobilising private sector investment in nature. So it'd be really helpful to hear any context for our standards as you tell us your views. Will, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kerry. It's lovely to see you again. Thanks for that nice introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Really exciting day, a really big and important milestone, actually. So my name's Will. I'm the Deputy Director in Defra for Nature Markets and Investment, but I might not be completely new to all of you. I'm new to this role, but I've been working in Defra in this kind of space for quite a long time, so it's lovely to be working on this with you all now. So today, right, really important milestone, the launch of the latest standards in what is now really a sort of a world-leading suite of standards, nature market standards for the UK. It's a huge privilege to be speaking to you all. You're the people who are going to adopt these standards, you'll apply them, maybe you'll change to align against some of them. You're going to bring them to life. I'll talk a bit this morning about our sort of journey within the government on nature markets generally, the progress we've been making both more sort of widely and on standards, and where we go next. But let me start with a few words generally about how the government's thinking about nature today. So Defra is an economic department. Defra is an economic department focused on growth, and that's because you all know without nature there is no growth. So we'll hear from the GFI later. Their work has shown that nature-related risks could reduce UK GDP by 3% or more over the next decade if they're left unaddressed. All sectors have to work together to protect and restore our shared natural capital. And last year, the Corrie Review, great read if you haven't read it, and the Corrie Review highlighted that Defra needs to take steps to support and provide coherence to nature markets. We reflected a lot of that in our strengthened environmental improvement plan, which came out last year. The first commitment in that plan is to mobilise more private investment to restore and protect nature in England. Kerry mentioned our first land use framework, the first land use framework for England. That was published last week. That sets out our vision for land and our implementation plans for supporting better land use decisions. The thrust there, it shows that building homes, restoring nature, maintaining food production and building clean power are not competing demands, they're complementary. And by thinking about that kind of efficient and effective use of land, we hope that we can support private investment into nature and help provide certainty about where and how to invest. And that's not all. The farm profitability review, right, that also came out last year, it points to the important role that private finance can play in a thriving and resilient farming sector, and how we can all work together to ensure that farmers in particular can confidently engage in nature markets at scale. This week, the new Farming and Food Partnership Board is going to meet. It's going to bring together farmers, food processors, retailers. It's going to champion growth and resilience in our domestic agricultural sector in these uncertain times, and it will certainly consider the important role of private finance in that space. So, across all those different areas, all those sort of live areas of policy development, we hear the same core set of messages. Nature is in decline, but it is also the foundations of growth and a growth opportunity in itself. Capital is ready to flow, but the market needs incubation if it is going to flow at scale. What can government do to support that process? Well, through conversation with industry, lots of you on the lines, we heard loud and clear the following message. High integrity practices in nature markets are not a nice to have. They are the foundation of effective nature markets. High integrity unlocks the confidence that investors need. It gives buyers clarity. It helps ensure that environmental outcomes are real, lasting, and measurable. And that's what allows private finance to scale in support of nature recovery. So in 2023, as Kerry mentioned, when we started this process, we had a very clear purpose. We wanted to make UK nature markets easier to navigate, to reduce inconsistency, confusion, to improve confidence, buyers, for sellers, for regulators, for investors, and for the communities who live with the outcomes of these projects. At that time, there was a real ambition in the market, but a real risk too, that fragmentation and mixed quality could undermine trust just as the sector was gaining momentum. So we set out to build a coherent, robust standards framework capable of underpinning a genuinely high integrity market. And here we are, making that vision real. The overarching principle standard provides the foundation for all UK nature market projects and is already in use. It's been trialed extensively through pilots with our fantastic early adopter organizations, most of whom are here today, and I want to thank them directly. It's been genuinely fascinating to hear the practical insights that have emerged, how the principles are being interpreted on the ground, where they drive better planning and decision making. That real world testing is exactly what ensures these standards work for the people using them. And it's great that these insights are available to everyone in the form of case studies. And of course, as Kerry mentioned, yesterday we launched two further standards, adding even more strength and coherence to the overall framework. You'll hear much more about these throughout today's session, but of course we've got the supply of biodiversity benefits, we've got the supply of nutrient benefits, we've got even more guidance, even more supporting documents out for consultation too. We also published yesterday the government response to our call for evidence on expanding the role of the private sector in nature recovery. We've heard loud and clear the importance of certainty, stability, and integrity. We're already using those insights in shaping our reforms to the water sector, where we're committed to growing the role of nature-based solutions and in putting together our farming roadmap. And then later this week, Defra, DESNZ, and Treasury, the government, will publish a summary of submissions to the consultation on voluntary carbon and nature markets. Once again, responses were clear on the importance of high integrity and robust market governance to build trust. So I'm really proud of what we've achieved so far. There is more. Standards only work when organizations can demonstrate that they're using them well. So we've also launched some assessment guidance. We're going to ask stakeholders, you, to begin assessing, self-assessing against the standards using that guidance. Very simple three-step process. Read the standards and the guidance, consider which functions are relevant to you. Assess yourself against the parts of the standard, and if you can, publish a short, transparent report showing how you meet them. That early action is going to help raise overall market standards and will prepare organizations for the next stage of the journey. Because over the next 2 years, we do intend to establish a fully robust independent assurance process. Accredited conformity assessment bodies are expected to become the main route for assurance. Starting self-assessment now means that you'll be ready for the transition, and we strongly encourage you to begin using those documents where you can right away. Finally, I want to highlight that these standards are designed for use across the UK. We've worked closely with colleagues in all our devolved governments to ensure that the assurance approach is consistent, coherent, and workable. Nature recovery is a shared ambition, and it's vital that our approach reflects that. So let me close. I'll say this. These standards aren't just documents. They're the foundations of a trusted, scalable, high-integrity market for nature, a market capable of delivering real environmental impact. That's what we all actually care about. A market that inspires confidence, a market that helps mobilize the private finance needed to meet the UK's nature and climate goals. Thank you for your leadership, your expertise, your ambition, your commitment. Thank you to everyone who's been involved. I hope today you find it inspiring and energizing, and I really do look forward to seeing the standards put into action in the months and years ahead. Thanks so much, Kerry.
Will, thank you so much for giving us a great start to our session and some fabulous context. And I think you've agreed to stay on for the next panel so that we can, yeah, that's fab. Cheekily, I think just before we start that panel, I'll just take advantage of our 1 minute time gain to ask you a question, if I may. So a second ago, when you were listing the ream of things that are coming out, you mentioned that at the end of the week, we're going to be hearing from Defra, but in harmony with DESNZ and the Treasury on the voluntary carbon side. So my question is, it's lovely to hear from you today with your Defra perspective of all the hard work that's gone on behind the scenes and the outcomes, but how can we ensure a whole of government approach so that nature markets and natural capital are really valued as central to the economic resilience of the country and our national prosperity? And then I guess sort of linked to that whole of government, joined up government point is, how can we ensure that the rules for planning and infrastructure and growth support all the things that you've just said, outcomes for nature, and don't kind of cut across our bows?
Good. How long have I got, Kerry? What do you want? Where are they? We'll just, let's cover that. Cover Sustainable Development 101 in the next 1 minute. Very good. So look, it's a fantastic question. So the cross-government point is really interesting because I think that I'm really motivated by this question and really have been for a long time. I think you have too, Kerry. I think there's two answers, and I think they work, I don't know, in different directions. One is this really big P political thing, right, which is just the vision. It's the kind of the Dasgupta review style kind of, we've got to stop treating, stop treating the environment, stop treating nature as though it's infinite and, always replaceable. We have to recognize that, it's the foundation of our economies, it's the foundation of, growth. And everyone needs to keep making the argument that we need to internalize it into our economic assessments. We need to internalize it into the way that we make all of our decisions, and that's got different words. People often talk about mainstreaming, as well, certainly at the international level. So there's that kind of big P, just keep saying the same thing to our political masters over and over again. Nature's in decline, and it's not something that we can, take for granted and imagine it's going to be there forever. You have to complement that with a really interesting set of, things that, steps that you take where the rubber hits the road. And I think the standards are a really strong part of that picture. But there's lots more. So the Green Book, right, which is the way that the Treasury assesses, all sort of spending, all government spending. It's the rule book that tells us how to assess that government spending. It's actually rolled out as well in quite a few other jurisdictions and countries around the world. It contains lots of guidance on natural capital assessment. It contains requirements now, very recently introduced, that government spending projects have to sort of take account of natural capital. It lays out the sort of the rules according to which that natural capital gets accounted. Building the evidence base is really important. So the ONS, maintain natural capital accounts. They're publicly available. It's super important data there about the sort of value of nature to the economy, and what that sort of the risk of losing that, of course. Natural England do some fantastic reports, in a sort of a similar place in a similar way. There's always more we can do, and I won't keep talking. I mean, your question about yeah, we'll move on. I just want to come to the planning question and I'll stop. So the planning question, yeah, I mean, it's about balance, right? It's about land use. It's about a huge kind of interlocking set of complicated policy decisions. I think that it's all too easy to sort of assume that government is sort of preoccupied with making a black or white decision about one or the other. That is not what is happening. Read the land use framework. The point is that we are assessing a huge number of different things against every decision that we make. Thanks.
Perfect. So let's think about how our standards can help achieve that balance. Thank you very much. We'll stick around. Let's move on to the first panel now, if we may. So now we are joined by Peter Phillips, who is the head of natural capital land management policy in the Scottish Government and may well have something to say about joined-uppedness and mainstreaming. Phoebe Tucker, who's the Senior Nature Associate at the Green Finance Institute, and George Setier, who is the lead for nature investment at BSI. So, George, I think perhaps a couple of questions just to kick off for you, please. Quite basic ones just to get us started. Who do you think is really meant to use these standards, and what is the approach that you envisage to assessment? What does it cover?
Yeah, and thanks, and hi everyone. Great to be here, and such a great moment for the programme. We're really proud to have released this new package of standards. So yeah, Kerry, in terms of your question, who are the standards for? Well, to be honest, a wide range of organisations may want to use the standards in different ways. So anyone could pick up these standards and say this is a really useful tool to set a common language, for example, a common framework that they might want to use as a reference. But there's a few particular organisations I'll focus on. So of those who can directly adopt the standards, there are, and when I say directly adopt, I mean organisations that can align their operations and become assessed against these standards. There's three sort of key groupings. So there's suppliers, and when we mean people who own or manage land, those who deliver projects, etc., those who hold the rights to manage the supply area. So suppliers, sellers, and sellers is an important distinction. They may be the supplier, but they may not be the supplier. So you might have a crediting program or a broker, for example, managing the sale of the credits. And thirdly, market intermediaries. So market intermediaries is quite a broad category. We define as organizations that contribute to market processes, and they include crediting programs, brokers, registries, trading platforms, etc. So all those organizations, they can directly adopt, align themselves to the standards. And then we have another important group, the really important group, buyers, investors, and regulators. You mentioned this already, but these organizations, they can't directly adopt the standards, but they can heavily drive the usage of the standards by others. So for buyers, it's about using these standards to give them assurances that who they work with and the credits that they buy are of high quality. similar for investors who they work with, and for regulators about informing their frameworks, etc. So that's who should use the standards. I think you mentioned also the assessment guidance, and Will touched on this in his intro as well. But effectively, that assessment guidance sets out everything that you need to know if you're one of those direct adopters, organisation that can be assessed to these standards. It's been developed from expertise in assurance, technical experts, gone through consultation, and incorporates the learning from the pilots that we'll hear about later today. It sort of sets out a range of guidance from what's applicable as part of the assurance, and that's an important point, because there may be parts of the standard that aren't applicable to you, and that's okay, because you might, as an organisation looking to adopt these, rely on others. You might rely on an external registry, for example, to show that you demonstrate that part of the standard, and so there's guidance on how to do that, and there's sort of tools and templates for conducting a self-assessment. So again, we'll mention this about self-assessments. We've kind of, we really want people to use these now. This is the key moment now. They're out. We want people to use these. So we've given everything we can to provide the support, the tools, the templates that people can do that, do self-assessment in a robust way, example of evidence that's required, and all based on the learnings from the pilots. So yeah, just finally, that's all on the hub. That's all on the Nature Investment Standards hub. And alongside that, we've got all our case studies of early adopters and how they've gone through and trialed this process themselves.
Thanks, George. I think that sort of spells out the landscape and the actors in it very well. And you described how the standards themselves are focused really on the supply side, but the idea is to drive usage by others and heavily influence the adoption. So I suppose that leads me on to a question for Phoebe. Phoebe, in your view, how can these BSI documents as a sort of suite help standardize the due diligence that perhaps sellers are doing, so that we can attract these buyers, so that we can get corporate buyers in, so we can attract institutional investors into nature at a scale that we need?
Thanks, Kerry. Yeah, it's a great question. So before I answer directly, just for context, at GFI we've been engaging UK corporates over the past few months, mostly on a one-to-one basis, and some were already familiar with the standards, others weren't. But overall, the conversations have been really useful for surfacing what actually matters to buyers. So to the question at hand, how can the standards help standardize due diligence? I can't emphasize enough how valuable that question is to the demand side. In our engagement, it's been the point that's gotten the most immediate amount of traction with buyers. It's certainly not all they care about, but it is the most, I'd say, the most tangible pain point they can reckon with. Because while corporates now generally understand the principles like permanence, community engagement, and additionality, they understand the business case for having those principles in place in their engagement. However, there's no independent, trustworthy rulebook for how these principles are operationalized. So they're really struggling with that. And as a result, procurement and legal teams often build bespoke due diligence processes from scratch. And that means long timelines, high internal cost, and a lot of uncertainty. So we're hearing of due diligence processes that take up to 2 years to get contracts signed, and often deals fall away entirely and the buyers become disenchanted with the process. It's really a shame to see. So that's where the standards come in. They won't remove due diligence entirely, but they standardize the starting point, I think is key to emphasize here. They create a common baseline for how integrity principles are evidenced and how information is disclosed and structured. So instead of every buyer reinventing the wheel, you get a predictable, repeatable framework that takes them at least some of the way. And so the idea is that when a corporate that recognizes the standards first approaches a project and that project is aligned with the standards, they'll have a lot more of that information at hand in a format that's more easily processed. And therefore, both the buyer and the seller or supplier, or maybe they're 3 different parties, as George has pointed out, they'll all face a shorter procurement and contracting journey. So overall, I think we are getting to a place where this theory of change can be demonstrated much more clearly, especially with the recent announcements and materials that have been released this week, the early adopters pilots and the new standards versions being published. Now that these elements are in place, I think we can work with corporates and institutional buyers much more actively to demonstrate exactly how the standards can be used to help natural capital at scale.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Phoebe. So you just referred to the suite of announcements that Will walked us through that are helping. And of course, these apply not only in England, but to all the devolved administrations. And England doesn't have the only announcements. So Peter, I think you have just this morning gone live with an announcement. We'd love to hear about that. I think ecosystem restoration and the code that you have in Scotland underlines high integrity as the Scottish government sees it. So could you just tell us a little bit about how the BSI standards have helped as you've been going through that process in Scotland?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Kerry. So first of all, I mean, just to clarify, the piece that we published earlier today, so it was at 8:30 actually, so a morning one. So we're referring to it as a competent model for the ecosystem restoration code. So it's a building block along the way to developing a fully functioning market mechanism, but we're not at that point yet where we're launching something that's kind of ready to go, if you like. So it's going to provide the basis for further testing and development this calendar year. But yeah, no, to come back to your question, you know, the BSI standards, to be honest, have been absolutely fundamental to the development of this piece. So I sat on the advisory group for Flex 702, the biodiversity benefit standard. And to be honest, the rigor and consistency of the approach to the development of that with Tom B, who's going to be on later, I think, and the rest of the group was really welcome, and the opportunity to input to that and apply, you know, that level of rigor and detail was great. There's been a whole bunch of other inputs though that have informed our competent model. So we did a big piece of desk-based research. We had a really quite extensive stakeholder engagement phase last summer. But to have that draft standard to work to as a kind of template or a checklist, if you like, for those key integrity and principles was really useful, really fundamental for us kind of working through and just making sure that our model, our emerging market mechanism, is high integrity in terms of what BSI were proposing. Just kind of one other point that's to mention. So we're adopting what we're calling a metric flexible approach to our new code. So yeah, it's really hard to measure biodiversity in one way. We all know that, so we're going to look at various metrics. But going forward, the extensive provisions on metrics and quantification in Flex 702 is going to be really useful for us. So we need to develop our own process for approving and accrediting metrics for the code, and also developing a field protocol that will cover all aspects of data collection, sampling, etc. in the field. So the extensive stuff on metrics and quantification in 702 is really useful for that. So yeah, big thumbs up from us, basically.
Well, that's fabulous to hear how sort of practical the standards are for you to use, and congratulations on the announcement of the restoration code. That's exciting. May I just ask a quick follow-up question? So how, I asked the same question to Will really, how are you tackling the joined up government side so that you feel that these standards will be picked up across the marketplace and influence construction in Scotland or port development or whatever it may be?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, I guess within SG, we tend to refer to this as kind of a natural capital approach, and we've been adopting that type of approach to policy making for some time. So just to kind of pick out a couple of highlights. So in 2022, we published an updated economic strategy, a kind of COVID response type economic strategy. And that sets out the government's overall aim of developing a well-being economy in Scotland and showing global leadership on rebuilding natural capital. So that's one of the first things that's mentioned right at the top of the strategy. And that's also where our commitment to developing a values-led, high-integrity market for responsible investment in natural capital sits. So I think the important thing is that, you know, the rebuilding of natural capital is positioned very much as an environmental and an economic imperative, which is really important for us. And just another quick point to note, so our kind of infrastructure investment plan from 2021 for the first time included natural infrastructure within its definition of infrastructure. So just to give you a couple of flavors there of where we're trying to embed nature in a natural capital approach across various aspects of policy development.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Thank you very much for those examples. We're trying to attract investment here in nature. It would be really interesting to ask all of you, perhaps Will and Phoebe in particular, how are you supporting blended finance models? What do you think is the way to match this money so that we can get to scale? And do you think the standards have a role in this? Perhaps Will first.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, so absolutely. So the standards, I mean, the standards are important, of course, because as we said at the beginning, you know, the standards help give assurance that, you know, the sort of buyer knows what they're buying, right? You know, and that's such an important part of this process and such an important part of getting the market kind of set up right. So I think the standards are really important there. I mean, on the question about blending, so it's intellectually really interesting, right? Because obviously there is a lot of capital out there, and in some instances you have to be sort of you know, you have to be conscious that that capital might not need blending. It might not need government support. It might be perfectly happy to flow in a straightforward private sector transaction. And of course, ultimately, that's what we want this market to look like, you know, in the long run, is to sort of taxpayer money is always fairly brittle. It can move very quickly in complicated ways. You know, we want this to set up and work with the private sector. But clearly, at the same time, you know, there's sort of a lot of risk in some areas of this market. There's a lot of risks that need managing. Investors like the confidence of the role that government finance can play. And so, you know, we do look at that very carefully. The eagle-eyed of you will have looked at our consultation yesterday, the response, and seen that there's some wording in there on the Big Nature Impact Fund, which is a blended finance fund that the UK government is really looking forward to, you know, getting started with, you know, this year, and that's going to leverage 30 million of, you know, government sort of first loss capital to support investment in a number of different areas.
Brilliant, thanks. Phoebe, any thoughts from your work? Is it a positive thing that we can think about private investment getting a little bit closer to the 6 billion gap that's been identified? What we need is this infrastructure of standards and policy that Will's referred to helping us bridge that, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is vital that we have private sector capital play a larger role. And I think it's, if I could build on that, it's where can private sector money pay for things, but also where shouldn't it? And I think it's okay to talk about the fact that sometimes it is just going to be a case for public money for public goods. But it's really understanding, as you say, using standards, using different mechanisms. BNF is a great example, but we've also got sort of this toolbox of blended finance mechanisms. For example, like guarantees. Can government offer guarantees to crowd in private sector capital at the start? And I think recently the government announced it was exploring the creation of a woodland purchase fund, woodland carbon purchase fund, to figure out, okay, if we put money towards the purchase of units in this way, could we crowd in more private sector capital? So I think we are making more progress, and I think we are understanding the different frameworks that can be used for blended finance, and standards certainly play a role in that, in understanding exactly what needs to be done in creating these transactions within these models and within these this broader understanding of how can people have confidence that they're doing the right thing, essentially, with the projects that they're supporting. The only other piece I'd add to that is I think that businesses are really making, what we're seeing is that businesses are becoming more understanding of the concept of resilience. And so it's not just about being asked to pay for things, it's should they be paying for things to help with their own business continuity, with their own risk management. And we're seeing some really interesting discussions. We recently published a report on East Anglia around how that co-investment piece could work. So I think that's just important to flag, but we could talk about this all day. I think the concept of blended finance and what's needed to enable it is on everyone's mind.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And by the way, I think that report you mentioned is worth everyone on the conference call here reading. The Norfolk-Suffolk one is excellent. I'm just looking at the questions that participants have been sending in, and I just want to take a slightly different tack, lady and gentlemen, before we move on to our next panel, which is we've been talking about the UK here. That's been what's driven this development to meet UK goals. But George and Will, any views as to whether this BSI Nature Market Standard Suite will be adopted and recognised internationally? George, do you want to come in first, then perhaps Will might add?
Yeah, if that's okay. So obviously these standards are designed for UK markets, but there is nothing in the standards that means, you know, that they can't be used and adopted internationally as well. We've actually had interest already by various international organizations saying it would be great if we can make these principles, the 701 standard, an international standard. So there's definitely interest there. I think it's just worth highlighting this is the first of its kind. So a set of standards that are integrating carbon, biodiversity, nutrients, natural flow, etc., other markets under a voluntary set of standards. That's not happening anywhere. So we've got global standards for carbon emerging. We've got stuff happening in biodiversity. We've got some national regulations, but a set of voluntary standards interconnecting these different markets. This is the first set, and it's the first set of integrated principles that were released in 701. And yeah, I think it would be great if we could explore how they could become more of an international thing, because standards, we want to standardize in the UK, but also what we're doing globally as much as possible. I don't know if Will wants to build on anything.
I mean, that's just a fantastic answer. So there's no question that this is genuinely world-leading work. And when I travel, internationally with the government, I mean, a huge number of people want to ask questions about our domestic experience, what we're learning, and to think about ways that might apply in their jurisdictions. I mean, it is very, very difficult to build global rule sets, right? So, like, to some extent, the UNFCCC has been building the international carbon market for 30+ years. It's a slow burn. But I mean, it's working and it's happening. So I think the question is, sort of, what can we do quickly, what can we do in the medium term, and what can we do in the long term, all the while I think underlining exactly what George has just said, which is this is genuinely world-leading work. Thanks, Kerry.
Okay, well, listen, it would be delightful to keep you all on for another hour just with this panel alone, because there's so much we could discuss, but there's other really good things to come. So what I'd like to do at this stage is to thank you all very much indeed for your contributions, and to ask you just to stay on, because it'd be delightful to have you in the background whilst we move to our second panel. Thank you. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to the standards themselves, just get a little bit more of an understanding of what these are. So we've heard about the overarching principle standard, that's 701, and that's already in use, but 3 more standards have now been launched and 2 are ready for use. That's Flex 702, the biodiversity market standard, and as you can see, we're joined by Tom Butterworth from Arup, and he's the lead author for that one, and then Flex 704, which is the nutrient market standards, and you'll see Gregor Neve from Thomson is the lead author there. Then there's another new standard, slightly different in kind. We'll hear about that one too. It's in a version 1, so it's out for consultation now, and that's Flex 705, and that's the one I mentioned earlier on community engagement and benefits. And for this, we're lucky to look to Matt Hannon from the University of Strathclyde. So let's dive in, guys. Tom, perhaps we can just start with you, Tom Butterworth, Tom B. How does the specific biodiversity standard work, do you think, with the existing one, the overarching principle standard, and what's Flex 702 aiming to achieve?
Thank you, Kerry. Real pleasure to be here. So all of the standards here linked together, and this is, as we've just heard from Will, is really important. So we've got the overarching principles in 701, and what 702 does is take those, build on those, specifically where there are additional requirements or specific issues that we need to deal with when we're dealing with a specific biodiversity market. And as we heard from Peter earlier, one of the key places where that plays out is how we quantify credits and how we measure change. And the standard doesn't specify one metric, but rather says these are the boundaries within which we need to work, the confines we need to work to deliver the right outcomes for the market and that high integrity for nature and for us all, the benefit from it. So that relationship is really critical, and you can really look at each principle and see how they sit in 701 and how it's built upon within 702 and then the flexes.
Grand, thank you. And may I just ask a follow-up question about the context? So in the United Kingdom, we now have a regulatory regime on BNG, biodiversity net gain, and internationally there are frameworks emerging like the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, and there's the IAPB, which is an international alliance that's looking at biodiversity credits. So I think you've been involved also with ISO work, international standard work on net gain. So could you just tell us a little bit about how these things hang together? How does the biodiversity standard interact, for example, with BNG, with the work that companies will be doing under TNFD, etc.?
So this has been a really critical part of the journey that we've taken to develop 702, to look at how these other pieces interplay. We've taken advice and got input from the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, and we've looked at the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure to see how they link up. Biodiversity net gain, which is the legally required in England, is also, we've got very similar and comparative approaches in Scotland, in Wales as well. What's interesting here is that we've built on the work from biodiversity net gain. We've understood the measuring change, what that means in terms of assessing biodiversity to make sure that that can become part of a market. But we haven't stopped there. We haven't limited ourselves to how that plays out in England. We've looked at what really high integrity means. And this is actually something that we've learned through that biodiversity net gain work in England. And I would say we've got a challenge here to then work with the biodiversity net gain work to actually increase and improve what we're doing there to make it in line with the standard. So that's really positive that we're learning on each piece of work we do and building on it. And that joins up with this international standard on biodiversity net gain. The joy of being able to be involved in both is that we've got those meshing really beautifully. And with the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure, there's a really interesting piece that what we're talking about there is looking at the dependencies we have on nature across our value chain and the impacts. And the dependencies are those ecosystem services. They're the other flexes. Yes, the carbon, the water, and so on that we're going to hear about in a moment. But the impacts absolutely lines up with the biodiversity story and the biodiversity assessment. And so TNFD, especially around that impact piece, starts to play into exactly this standard, especially if we're then insetting or offsetting to address the impacts that we might be having across our value chain. So we've tried to make sure that they link beautifully together and that they complement one another. That's our ambition, and love to hear more feedback on how that's working.
Well, it's a fabulous aim, Tom, and I can't think of a better person to be involved at the heart of all of it to try and see that it's joined up. So thank you. Stand by. So that was biodiversity, a quick introduction. Gregor, may I turn to you? Can you just tell us a little bit about the nutrient standard? Is this for compliance or voluntary nutrient markets or both? And then if I may just give you a second question at the same time. So all of these standards, but this one in particular, I think could be quite aspirational in places. It's quite sort of top end. So can you just tell us a little bit about what it's trying to achieve and how we can get people to use it now?
I can try, yes. I'll take a step back and say, where have nature or nutrient markets been? The most recent iteration on and potentially the most popular or unpopular, depending on how you look at it, market has come from nutrient neutrality, which some of you may be aware of. That was really reactive. It wasn't planned, took most people by surprise. I won't go into the ins and outs of it, but what it did was almost overnight required suppliers of nutrient credits to be linked up with demanders of nutrient credits, largely housing developers. And that left us with quite a varied market across the landscape of England and arguably in Wales too. So local authority by local authority, place by place, the market sort of evolved in different ways. That's led to questions of quality over delivery and whether claims are robust, all the things that we've already heard about today. So Flex 704, for the first time, I think, provides a standard against which we can assess integrity of nutrient projects and credits, whether that's in regulatory markets like nutrient neutrality or whether in voluntary ones. So suppliers, for the first time, can align to and claim high integrity, and purchasers have more confidence in what they are buying. I think that's a really important step forward. The standard sets minimum requirements, so for transparency, quantification, validation, verification, and lasting benefits. Those are the things that I've heard in practice on the ground and through policy spaces too that people want. It was really good to hear that GFI has also found the same. And ultimately it builds trust in nutrient markets. So where that might be lacking in places, especially in the nutrient neutrality market space, I think now we've got an ability to try and build that trust and standardize it across markets.
Excellent. So could you tell us a little bit about who you think should be using it? Who would you like to see using that standard now, and how do you think they'll benefit from using it?
So suppliers are the important people, the most important people, arguably. So we have people who want nutrient or high integrity nutrient credits, and that could be in regulatory markets like nutrient neutrality. It could be evolving markets. I'm going to mention environmental delivery plans and conservation measures. Who knows whether that will be considered a standard market or not, but in my head it does seem to be that way. If you've got the demand, which is there at the moment, the demand is outstripping supply, so we want suppliers to be able to go out, pick this up, have a look at it, think, okay, I've got some land, or I've got access to land, or I've got rights to do something to land. Is this an option for me to do? At the moment, or before the publishing of all of these standards, but for nutrients, it was a bit of guesswork. So you'd say, I've heard of nutrient neutrality, or I've heard that people might want to do things to land, or to claim benefits for water quality. I'm not sure about how to go about that. So I think for suppliers to pick this up, use it, and go, okay, if I want to do this, this is what I need to do. This is what I need to do to be able to claim that what I'm delivering on my land is high integrity. Ultimately, what we want from this standard, the aim of this standard, is for the nutrient markets to play a tangible role in nature recovery. I think that would be my criteria for success for this standard.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. I think that gives us a good flavour on nutrients. Matt, let's turn to you now, if we may, because it's a little bit of a different story with Flex 705. So this is all about engagement with local communities and making sure that there's a fair share of benefits, essentially, that are going to the communities where the projects are based. Can you tell us a little bit about its inception and how it's structured and how you go about getting communities involved?
Yeah, thank you, Kerry. Yeah, well, I think the inception really comes from the kind of problem statement around why we would need such a standard. And that's grounded in the fact that these natural capital projects or nature projects, which together make up the nature market, these are essentially a set of landscape interventions. And these interventions are designed to, for the reasons that Gregor and Tom have just talked about, provide an uplift in terms of biodiversity, carbon sequestration, nutrient provision. And really, and these may or may not generate credits, which can then be sold on the open market. But the idea around this is, in effect, you are having a tangible and direct impact upon these natural capital stocks and the ecosystem services that these provide. And we know that these ecosystem services are the bedrock of our society and our economy, whether that's clean air, water purification, pollination of crops. So they have a direct impact upon us as people, as communities. Now, you would think in the round, and quite rightly, because we depend on these services, these projects should, in a sort of overall sense, have a net benefit for these communities. And most of the time they will. But if these projects are designed in such a way that they are not designed with communities in mind, those, and let's just be clear who we're talking about, these are the people who live in close proximity to these projects, maybe even on the land that these projects are taking place, that if they're not properly and effectively engaged with, and the considerations about the types of benefits that they require in the long term, because these communities are the custodians of these projects, ultimately, because they are the custodians of the land, that they may have a negative impact, and that is obviously problematic for all the reasons that we've heard from the speakers. These need to be high integrity markets, and these need to be high benefit projects for communities.
Mm-hmm. And presumably it's equally important for license to operate for the companies engaged. Yeah.
And absolutely, and underpinning this is about legitimacy, the legitimacy of these projects, and a long-term multi-generational relationship between the project and the communities.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So can you just tell us a little bit about where it is at? I think it's been launched for consultation. Is there anything you'd specifically like to get from it? What do you want the people on the webinar to contribute?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if I may just say what exactly is kind of contained in this standard before I talk about the consultation. But this, I think there's two key themes that come out time and time again from this, and we dig into more detail, which we haven't got time to talk about here. but it's about how we engage with communities, and around that is how we empower communities, but also how we enrich communities, and that's about the creation and sharing of benefits from these projects. So the standard went live yesterday, I believe, and with that, and I should say it's a code of practice, so it is quite different from some of the other flexes that we've heard about, which are specifications. This code of practice will be presenting more sort of should type statements rather than will, and with that there is an opportunity for a little bit more space and flexibility for innovation to emerge. We know that these projects are quite different from one to the next. And they are different types of projects, different types of communities, different types of landscapes. So answering your question, I think one of the key things we're looking for here is, one of the key principles underpinning this is proportionality. So some of the clauses need to be applied proportionally, whether that's impact assessment, benefit sharing, engagement with communities. And so we're looking amongst a whole range of other questions. If I've got time, I'll reference them, Kerry. But how do we apply this proportionality? Is as written, is this manageable, verifiable in the eyes of not just communities but developers and other practitioners? And I think beyond that, some of the other aspects that we'd really value feedback on is whether it's sufficiently clear and robust for these communities and practitioners to pick up and run with. Is there sufficient flexibility? Does it work for all projects, different shapes and sizes? And I think finally, are there any risks or unintended consequences associated with what we've outlined? It's a really tricky balance to strike. We're wanting to support the growth of a high integrity marketplace, and at the same time, we're wanting to empower and enrich communities. And we try to present a standard that achieves both. But I think from people on the ground, people who are working in these spaces day in, day out, they may see unintended consequences or risks that we haven't yet identified between the authorship and the advisory group. So we would really welcome feedback on that.
That's great. There's nothing quite like using something in real life, is there, to reveal things that when you've got a pen in your hand and you're writing, you perhaps haven't foreseen. Matt, you described how this has been launched as a consultation document, and therefore this learning from people and their responses is really important to you. But I think it's probably important equally to Tom and Gregor with the other standards. We're really hoping that people, whether the standards are in version 1 or version 2, will take them, use them. Flex standards are very iterative, so it gives us a chance to learn and improve. So I think that applies to everybody. Thank you very much indeed for your contributions, for bringing those individual standards a bit to life for us, so people can understand what's there. I know my colleagues have been posting links in the chat, so people can access the documents freely. Again, be smashing to continue to run through more questions with you, because there are loads more from the audience. But in the interest of time, I'll leave it there with you. Thank you very much, and we'll move on to our next panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, so as I promised in my introduction, we're not only talking about the individual standards, their evolution on paper, but we have an opportunity now to talk about practitioners and their experiences of the standards, and we've got 3 great people for you to hear from. Flex 701, that's the overarching principle standard, has actually been out there in the wild for a year now, being used by people. And last autumn, BSI launched an early adopter program, and that was really to work with organizations to do very much what Matt was just describing, to help people pilot Flex 701, test its application in practice. You all have gathered, those of you who've had an opportunity to take a look at it, that 701 is very broad. It's an ambitious standard. It spans multiple markets, types of activity, geographic regions. So it's really important to see how the quite crisp set of principles it embodies can actually be used in different contexts. And BSI got a fabulous engagement and selected a group of 9 organizations with whom to work on these pilots. And together, each pilot did a trial assessment, and through that, everyone got to learn. So the organizations got to really see how their activities stacked up and performed against a standard. BSI and Defra got to understand how the assessment needs really work in practice, and to get practical insights from people so that they can improve it. So these organisations are really leading the way. I'm hugely grateful to the panellists for joining us and being willing to share what they've learned. I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. So it's great that we have Amy Coulthard from Entrade, Tom Ashton from Native Aqua, and Owen Middleton from the Environment Bank. So how to kick off the discussion? Maybe, Amy, we can start with you. Just could you please tell us what drove you to be involved in the pilot? Why did you take it on? What's in it for you? Why do you think that the standard and the pilot are important for Entrade and for your stakeholders across the many landscapes that you're working in?
Thank you, Kerry. Yeah, so Entrade was already an established market operator, and we were following the high integrity principles already and had our independent governance, transparent market rules, and quite established market processes in place. But actually, building trust and confidence is really vital if the nature markets are going to scale, which we've already heard from some of the previous speakers. So it was really important to Entrade to apply the standard to further build that trust and confidence for all the market participants, whether they're suppliers or buyers, investors, so a whole range of people. And it's very much in Entrade's DNA to be innovative, open, transparent, and to look for that continuous improvement. So we actually saw applying the standard, the flex standards in real life, was really important to help us improve, but also to enable us to test those standards and feedback to BSI if there were any areas that maybe needed clarification, or we weren't really sure how to apply, and so on. So and feedback on the process as well is really important. So that's why we took part, really.
Got it. And do you think it kind of reaches through to your stakeholders and participants? Are they aware that you're trialing it? Have you been seeking their feedback? And we've heard from our very frank and expert authors of standards that one of the things they have their eye on when they're developing these is unintended consequences, things that they just didn't spot. Are you able to share any feedback that you've had from your stakeholders, anything that you've learned that's been able to influence the improvement of 701?
Yeah, so we learned a lot through the process, and we'd always felt that we were being very transparent in what we were doing. But we learned through going through the process that there was a little bit more information that we could be putting out to really support buyers in the market. So that was quite an interesting learning about some of the additional information that maybe we could get out there. We were really pleased that we got that reinforcement, and we were able to talk to a lot of our stakeholders about the fact that the BSI really drew out some of those areas where we were particularly strong in our conformity, so around our governance and the registries that we hold and the tracking and tracing of credits. So we had some really strong areas as well, and it was great to be able to talk to local planning authorities as well as buyers and suppliers about how important those aspects are. So yeah, it's a really interesting process.
That's fascinating. It's interesting to think about the dialogue between yourselves as practitioners and local planning authorities, because a lot of these nature markets are very new. So it's almost a form of capacity building, having that discussion. So that's terrific. Thank you, Amy. That gives us a good insight into the Entrade pilot, and thank you for stepping forward to do it. So Owen, to you, please. So if I understand correctly, the Environment Bank tested the standard, the 701 standard for your BNG operations, biodiversity net gain operations. So you guys, you're in the business of applying mandatory BNG requirements anyway. So it would be great if you could please explain what your motivations were, what additional benefits might come from applying a Flex 701 on top of applying the regulations.
Yeah, great question. And I think first of all, just kind of echo everything that Amy said. I think I'm probably just going to be repeating a little bit there, but obviously, yeah, Environment Bank, we're a purpose-led business, so we have lots of stakeholders that really care about us pushing the integrity of both our product, but also that of the wider market. For the integrity to be as high as possible. And I should probably start by saying, we do take pride in what we consider to be an already very high integrity approach to habitat bank design and ecosystem restoration anyway, but obviously it is very easy for anyone to say that. But because we genuinely do believe this, we jump to the opportunity to test our assumptions through the Flex pilot and to learn what extra we might need to be doing to kind of really push for that highest integrity benchmark possible. And I think the first thing is that this has just been really well received by our stakeholders and colleagues who basically believe that the only right approach is a high integrity approach. So it's been really great just to reassure people that we are sort of striving for this in every way. And we were relieved to see that actually following the standard sort of BNG process, if done well, you already do get quite a fair way towards alignment with the BSI Flex standard anyway. And so we feel that this is a really positive reflection of how BNG has been designed and is being, you know, operationalized. But the framework does only go kind of so far and does allow some flexibility, which is both good and sometimes not so good in terms of how the regulations are implemented. So we think that BSI Flex really does help to fill some of those gaps to really sort of differentiate between the high integrity credits and for those that, you know, still have some work to do. And I think a good example of this is the requirement of having mechanisms in place to kind of manage uncertainty in the quantification of the credits and the methods being used, but also kind of risk around overselling units. This is something that we think we do quite well anyway, so it was nice to see that what we do will be sort of recognized and kind of rewarded by the BSI Flex standard. So this is things like ensuring confidence in the surveys that we're doing at our habitat bank. So these are things that have to be led or supported by FISC level for ecologists, which for those of you who don't know, this is a qualification that signals kind of high level identification skills in the field. And in terms of avoiding overselling units, we use contingency buffers in the number of predicted units and those that are actually kind of sold to the market to mitigate that risk around overselling. So these things aren't required by the BNG framework, but it's good practice. And we were delighted that this is sort of recognized by the standard. And I think finally, kind of the key outcome, and this is sort of similar again to what Amy said around sort of transparency, is that we realized that we did need some better documentation for some of our processes just to make sure it was standardized and we could evidence that we were doing this in practice, you know, in a standardized and consistent way. So things like ensuring sort of ecologist impartiality of the sites, which we have been doing, but didn't necessarily have a company policy in place for this. This is something that we will be working to develop to make sure that we can evidence this. And also another one is around kind of local community engagement, which we've been doing in sort of an ad hoc way. Just making sure that this is, you know, we have a real sort of process in place for managing kind of grievances, and just basically just making sure that we, you know, have the process in place to drive as much positive social impact as possible, which is something that we all fundamentally care about. So yeah, it's been really great. There's been lessons in terms of sort of gaps where we might need to be more transparent on things. It gives us a mechanism to be kind of rewarded for the things we're already doing that kind of goes above and beyond BNG. So yeah, it's been a really positive process.
That's fabulous. Just one reflection from what you've said. You've referred to sort of market differentiation, and I feel like that's a sort of, it's a real leadership position. You've just said above and beyond. For lots of actors in the market, do you think there might be a bit of sort of, well, we're doing the law, you know, oh, don't give us yet another thing to go above and beyond, but you clearly see benefits in doing so. Does it sort of streamline the process some? It'd just be interesting to hear, not just for leaders, but for the mass market, how using a standard might help them beyond basic compliance.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, you know, we get a lot of kind of clients coming to us and sort of asking for, you know, what sets aside your biodiversity units from these other providers. And, you know, there's so many ways to kind of take this. There's so many additional things you could do. And sort of understanding where the priorities are and just making sure everybody's sort of singing from the same hymn sheet. I think this standard really sort of helps with that. So when, you know, buyers come and ask those questions, they might sort of have an expectation of the kind of things to look out for, and it gives suppliers and suppliers of biodiversity units obviously those extra things to sort of aim for and add on and make sure they're sort of definitely including in the sort of provision and generation of those biodiversity units. So yeah, I think the sort of standardization and kind of just having a guidebook almost from these standards will be really useful, just so everybody's, you know, talking the same language really.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Owen. So Tom, turning to you now. So native aqua, I think you're a relatively new entrant to the market. So how did the standards apply to you at your kind of early stage? What did it help with? And has it changed anything that you're doing on the back of your experiences?
Yeah, so thanks, Kerry. Our business is has two main strands. We're essentially breeding a good bloodline of native oyster for aquaculture, for farming. So that's our sort of core. And then we identified this possibility to fund this quite challenging operation by entering into the nature credits markets to monetize and the ecosystem services of this species, which is biodiversity uplift and nutrient removal. And our entry into this market was at a very early stage. We were building a sort of scientific framework, collaborating with universities, PhD programs, that sort of thing, trying to understand what really makes a good high integrity market, a credit, sorry. And at this exact moment in time, we came across the BSI Flex 701 early adopter scheme, which actually proved an incredibly good opportunity for us to use this document as essentially a template whilst really in the early stages of forming our protocols and plans. So rather than trying to sort of retrofit it to existing schemes, so the timing was absolutely excellent, and I think it was actually very progressive of BSI to include such an early stage business as ours onto the scheme, but it certainly allowed us to shape our engagements with academia and other businesses along the lines of best practice right from the day one. So that has been a massive step gain in efficiency for us in building best practice from the ground up.
That's fabulous, thank you. Well, now I have a kind of general question to all of you. It's in two parts. One is people may not quite understand the mechanics of being a pilot, so maybe you could just reflect on what it entailed, and then it would be really nice. Obviously we're encouraging more and more people to use the standards and feedback information, so it'd be great if you could also offer some advice to others who are considering adopting the BSI standards, some sort of things that you would recommend that they do. So maybe I'll go back to Amy. Could you just tell us what a pilot entails briefly, and then offer some advice to people who are thinking of picking up a standard and using it to align their project with?
Thank you, Kerry. And one of the great things about being a pilot is you get a little bit more support than maybe you would if you weren't in a pilot. So having BSI by our side throughout was really, really helpful. So the pilot started with a self-assessment process, which was really straightforward and pretty simple to do in terms of going through a bit of a checklist of looking at all the different principles and rules in the standard, and then looking at how you think you conform with that. So that was a really straightforward and simple process to do. And anyone thinking about doing this, that's a great place to start. So starting with a self-assessment against the standard, and just, complete it first as a sort of fairly quick exercise, and then go back to areas in detail where you just want to delve a little bit deeper. And I think that's a really great place to start. The second part of it was really working more closely with BSI, who were delving in to what we were doing and asking us lots of questions and wanting to see our documentation, wanting to see evidence of what of how we were meeting the standard. So that was a much more in-depth part to it. And I think from our perspective, that actually aligned really well with our existing audit processes. So we already had an annual audit in place with Soil Association certification. So we were quite used to going through that process. But if you're going through that for the first time, it can feel a little bit daunting. And the best advice I can give you is, if you are working through the assessment process with another party, prepare your documents in advance. It makes it much easier and much quicker.
That's fabulous. So self-assessment being a great place to start. First off, doing it as a quick exercise. And if you're doing an audit process and perhaps are new to it, making sure you've got as many as possible of the documents lined up before that process starts. Those are two great tips. Owen, how about you? Tell us.
Yeah, again, I just feel like I'm going to echo some of what Amy just said. But yeah, completely agree there, particularly on the initial kind of rapid assessment. So just sort of treat it like a gap analysis. Like, where do you think your biggest gaps are going to be, and start sort of making a plan for those to begin with. And then I guess the other thing to add, and it's sort of aligned with Amy's advice around just making sure all the documents are there, because that absolutely is key. Just be prepared for this to be kind of a company-wide project in a way, because it will require sort of working with colleagues across the organization, whether that's in terms of sort of, in our case, it's like Habitat Bank delivery to finance, legal, and even sales teams, just to make sure you know exactly all the processes that are happening, what needs to be a bit more formalized, and so on and so forth. So yeah, just prepare to sort of talk early to colleagues to kind of socialize this idea, and it'll make it easier to gain sort of buy-in, and make sure that any change is kind of lasting and really does drive sort of long-term positive impact. So yeah, work collaboratively across the organization would be the other bit of advice.
That's a great one, because all of this is very interdisciplinary, really, isn't it? Multidisciplinary. You've got the science and the governance and the law and the procedural things. So yeah, I get it. That's a really good tip. Reach out to colleagues across the organization. Thank you. Tom, what about you?
So the self-assessment for us was more following guidance and actually forming our plan for what our processes and documentations are going to be like in a theoretical sense, because we were sort of pre-production, pre-reality, if you like. We were still at the planning phase. So rather than assessing our existing processes, we went through the Deflex 701 and laid out what we feel the best practice is going to be, what we're going to do, and described it where appropriate to the standards. So this was enormously helpful, and I think going to advice for other businesses, early stage businesses, pick this up as soon as you can. Pick this up when you're still at the idea stage, and then build even your thinking around this rather than trying to adapt it later on. And I think that's a huge opportunity to have been brought into this program, allowed to test even our planning and thinking against it. So rather than assessing ourselves, we were using it as a tool to build our theoretical and now fully in place procedural plans.
Brilliant. I think that's a really, when you're fortunate enough to come across it early days, there's obviously efficiencies to be gained from building it in. Excellent. Listen, again, it would be lovely to continue to talk to all of you more. There's so much more to learn, but some of it's in the case studies. And I'm very grateful to all of you. Thank you for a splendid session. Just for want of time, we need to wrap up now. But we look forward to continuing to learn from your experiences. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kerry.
So we're just wrapping up now in the final minutes, and I wanted to check that everybody has spotted that the guidance, the case studies, and the supporting insights on the nature investment standards are on the hub. You can also, on that hub, you can move to the navigation tool and take a look at that. It helps you work your way through the plethora of different standards and figure out which parts are relevant to your business. Yeah, so I think just closing very briefly, there are 3 things that we'd love you to do. I do sincerely hope you found this interesting and useful. I've loved it. The 3 things are: please read and use the adoptable standards. That's the overarching standard 701, biodiversity 702, and nutrients 704. You'll find the link to the navigation tool on the hub that I just mentioned. Consider self-assessment. You just heard from all 3 participants in the pilots that the self-assessment part is a super helpful start to your engagement with the BSI standards. So consider self-assessment of your operations. You'll find that there's assessment guidance online, and here you can see the QR codes that take you to that. And then 705, the communities one, is out now for consultation, and we'd really love to hear from you. You remember what Matt Hannon had to say. This is open until the 19th of May, and you'll find a link to the consultation page on our set of links. So I think that is it for today. We're just coming in time, which is fabulous. Thank you to the organisers for making the tech run smoothly. I was delighted that the gods of the internet were with us today. Thank you all for making the time to join us, and thank you for your engagement with the programme. We really appreciate it. Okay. Bye for now.